58 years ago, a schoolteacher in the coal country of Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, vanished on a Sunday afternoon in October, leaving behind an unlocked front door, a pot of soup still simmering on the stove, and a blue cardigan draped over the back of her kitchen chair. Authorities at the time concluded she had left of her own accord. They found no signs of struggle. They had no witness to anything different. And within 8 months, the case was shelved. Her family never accepted that conclusion. Not for a single day. Her younger sister, in particular, spent decades insisting that something was wrong, that the woman she had grown up with, the woman who called every Sunday without exception, the woman who had never once been late for school in 11 years of teaching, had not simply walked out of her own life without a word. She was right. Then, nearly 6 decades later, in the spring of 2024, the sister's daughter was clearing out the attic of the family home ahead of an estate sale. In a cedar chest, tucked inside a copy of a Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, she found a letter, handwritten, dated October 1966. A letter that had never been mailed and that would finally name, after 58 years, what happened to Dorothy Haynes. To understand what that letter meant, you first have to understand who Dorothy was. Pittston Township, Pennsylvania, in the autumn of 1966, was a community that wore its history in its bones. The Susquehanna River ran cold and dark at the edge of town, and the hillsides were cut through with abandoned colliery entrances, reminders of the industry that had built Luzerne County and hollowed it out in equal measure. By 1966, most of the big mines were closed, but the town that had grown up around them remained. Close-knit, Catholic, unassuming. The kind of place where people still left their screen doors unlocked and knew the names of their neighbors' children. October there smelled like wood smoke and turned leaves. The maples along Church Street went red and gold before anywhere else in the county, and the women of St. Michael's Parish organized an apple butter sale every Columbus Day weekend that drew people from as far as Scranton. Children walked to school in wool coats. Men drove station wagons to the Union Hall on Saturday mornings. Television sets in living rooms across Pittston Township tuned to the evening news every night at 6. Walter Cronkite's voice as familiar and steady as the tide. Dorothy Haynes had grown up in that world and built her life in the center of it. She was 34 years old in 1966. With dark hair she wore pinned up during the school week and loose on weekends, and a habit of humming to herself while she worked that her students had quietly nicknamed her for. Miss Hum. She taught 5th grade at Pittston Township Elementary and had done so for 11 years without a single sick day that anyone could recall. Her classroom was famous for its window boxes of marigolds, which she replanted every September, and for the smell of cinnamon, which she kept in a small dish on her desk and said helped children concentrate. She was the eldest of 3 children. Her sister Carol was 5 years younger and lived with her husband and 2 small boys 4 streets away. They spoke on the telephone every Sunday evening without exception. They had done so since the early 1960s, when their mother had first insisted on it as a condition of Dorothy moving into her own apartment. It had long since stopped being an obligation and become something else. The fixed point around which both of their weeks quietly revolved. Dorothy had been engaged once, in the late 1950s, to a man named Paul Whitmore, who worked for a coal transport company. The engagement had ended by 1961, and Dorothy had rarely spoken about it since. She kept a photograph of a dog she had growing up, a mutt named Biscuit, framed on her kitchen windowsill. She saved a portion of each paycheck in a savings account she had opened in 1958. She had been planning, for several years, to visit Ireland. She had never gone. On the morning of October 16, 1966, Dorothy Haynes attended the 8:30 Mass at St. Michael's Parish, stopped at Gallagher's Market on the way home for soup vegetables, and waved to her neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, from the front porch. That was the last time anyone outside her family would ever see her. At approximately 11 a.m. on Sunday, October 16, 1966, Dorothy Haynes went inside her apartment on Chestnut Street and began making soup. At 4 p.m., her sister Carol called. No answer. At 6:30 p.m., Carol called again. No answer. By 7:15 p.m., Carol had driven to Chestnut Street with her husband Bernard. The front door was unlocked. The soup was on the stove. Low heat, not yet burned, but reduced down to almost nothing. The blue cardigan was over the kitchen chair. Dorothy's purse was on the counter. Her coin change, her library card, her house key. Her church missal was on the kitchen table, still open to that morning's gospel reading. Dorothy was not there. Carol called the Pittston Township Police from Dorothy's kitchen telephone at 7:22 p.m. 2 officers arrived within the hour. They walked through the apartment. They noted the unlocked door, the simmering pot, the personal effects left behind. They noted that there was no sign of disturbance, no broken furniture, no marks on the doorframe. They told Carol that people sometimes needed to get away, that Dorothy was an adult, that it was too early to file a missing persons report. Carol filed one anyway, the following morning. 3 days passed. Then a week. The police canvassed Chestnut Street. Mrs. Kowalski confirmed the 11 a.m. sighting. No other neighbor had seen anything. Gallagher's Market confirmed Dorothy's purchase that morning. The receipt was found in her cardigan pocket. She had bought parsnips, carrots, a soup bone, and a bunch of flat-leaf parsley. She had been planning on eating Sunday dinner. On October 23rd, a week after her disappearance, Dorothy's principal at Pittston Township Elementary told a reporter from the Wilkes-Barre Record that Dorothy's class was being covered by a substitute and that he expected her back soon. He looked, by all accounts, uncertain when he said it. One detail, small and overlooked in the initial days, would take decades to become significant. Dorothy's next-door neighbor, a retired foreman named Vincent Caruso, had noticed a car parked on Chestnut Street that Sunday afternoon that he did not recognize. A dark green sedan, American-made, parked in front of the apartment building between noon and 2 o'clock. He mentioned it to one of the officers who canvassed the street. The officer wrote it in his notebook. The notebook was filed with the report. The sedan was never identified. By November, the school had hired a permanent replacement teacher. By Christmas, the soup pot had been returned to Carol. By the following spring, the Pittston Township Police had moved Dorothy's file to a low-priority classification. There were no active leads. There were no suspects on record. There was no body. The apartment on Chestnut Street was relet in January 1967. The new tenant kept the window boxes but did not plant marigolds. The investigation that followed Dorothy Haynes's disappearance was led by Detective Bernard Maltsevsky of the Pittston Township Police, a deliberate, square-shouldered man who had worked the county for 20 years and who was troubled, from the beginning, by the soup pot. In 20 years, Maltsevsky told colleagues, he had never worked a voluntary disappearance where the woman left her Sunday soup on the stove. People who meant to leave took their purse. They took their key. They made arrangements, even quietly, even secretly. Dorothy Haynes had done none of those things. The apartment on Chestnut Street looked, to Maltsevsky's eye, like a room someone had stepped out of with every intention of returning. He pursued 2 early leads. The first centered on Paul Whitmore, Dorothy's former fiancé, whose broken engagement in 1961 had not been entirely without bitterness, according to people in the parish who remembered the period. Whitmore was interviewed in November 1966. He was cooperative. He expressed concern for Dorothy. His alibi for the afternoon of October 16th, he had been watching the Pittsburgh Steelers game at his brother-in-law's house in 40 Fort with 6 other witnesses, was confirmed. He was eliminated from consideration. The second lead came from the school. One of Dorothy's colleagues, a male teacher named Gerald Frick, had left the district abruptly at the end of September 1966, 2 weeks before Dorothy's disappearance. Malchivsky tracked him to Philadelphia. Frick was interviewed there in December 1966. He had taken a teaching position in Philadelphia following a personal matter he declined to specify. He had a verifiable record of his whereabouts for the entire month of October. He was eliminated. Carol Haynes, meanwhile, was doing something the investigation could not do. She was listening. She heard, in the months following Dorothy's disappearance, that a man from the parish, a man named Walter Grebb, who had grown up 2 streets from the Haynes family home and who had worked, briefly, at the same coal transport company where Paul Whitmore had once been employed, had been seen arguing with a woman matching Dorothy's description outside Gallagher's Market the previous summer. Carol brought this to Malchevsky in the spring of 1967. Malchevsky interviewed Walter Grebb twice. Grebb acknowledged knowing Dorothy from the parish. He denied any argument. His wife confirmed he had been home all day on October 16th. Without physical evidence linking him to the scene, and with no body and no witness account from October 16th itself, Malchevsky could go no further. Then came the institutional failure that would define the next half-century of this case. In August 1967, the Pittston Township Police Department was absorbed into a reorganized Luzerne County Sheriff's structure. Case files from the previous department were transferred in bulk. In that transfer, a portion of Malchevsky's investigative notes, including his personal file detailing the summer argument at Gallagher's Market and his characterization of Walter Grebb as a person of interest, were separated from the official case file and misfiled under an administrative reference number. Malchevsky retired in 1971. He told Carol Haynes at a chance meeting outside St. Michael's Parish that summer that he had never stopped thinking about her sister's case. He died in 1979. His personal notes died with the misfiling. The case file that survived contained no named suspect. It contained no active lead. It contained, effectively, the question and nothing else. By 1975, 9 years had passed. The apartment building on Chestnut Street had turned over 3 times. The marigold window boxes were long gone. Most of the people who had known Dorothy Haynes from the parish were older now. Their memories of her softened by time into something more like an impression than a person. A quiet woman, a good teacher, the one who disappeared. By 1985, 19 years on, Carol's 2 sons were in high school. She had never stopped marking October 16th. Every year on that Sunday she attended Mass at St. Michael's, lit a candle at the side altar, and drove past the old apartment on Chestnut Street. Her husband Bernard eventually stopped asking her not to. By 1993, 27 years after Dorothy's disappearance, Walter Grebb had died of a stroke. He had lived in Pittston Township his entire life, attended the same parish, been seen at the same functions, sat in the same pew. Carol had watched him at Christmas Mass every year and known, in a way she could never prove, exactly what he had taken from her. By 2004, the house that had belonged to Grebb's family on Caruso Street passed to his son, Russell, and then to Russell's widow, Evelyn, who had no children of her own and whose primary concern with the property, by 2020, was the state of the roof and what to do with 50 years of accumulated belongings. Carol Haynes died in 2019 at the age of 82. She had spent 53 years looking for her sister. She did not get her answer. Her daughter, Patricia Lemke, had grown up with Dorothy's absence the way some children grow up with religion, not chosen, simply present, shaping everything. After Carol's death, Patricia took on what her mother had carried. She wrote to the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office in 2020, asking for the case to be reviewed. She was told the file was open but inactive. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Dorothy. The case had been cold for 57 years, when in the spring of 2023, Patricia Lemke learned that Evelyn Greb was preparing to sell the house on Caruso Street. The estate sale was scheduled for April 2024. Patricia does not know, to this day, what made her drive past that house in February of 2024. But she did. And it put something in motion that she could not have anticipated. It would take a cedar chest, an old Bible, and a letter that was never meant to be found. Evelyn Greb had never been close to her late husband Russell's family. She had married Russell in 1987, 14 years after his father Walter's death, and what she knew of the elder Greb came filtered through the careful, edited version that families construct around their difficult members. She knew that Walter had been a hard man. She knew that Russell had rarely spoken of him. She did not know anything about Dorothy Haynes. In the winter of 2024, in the weeks before the estate sale, Evelyn had hired a service to clear the house room by room. She had asked them to set aside anything that looked personal, photographs, documents, letters, so she could review them before the sale. The attic, the service reported back to her, was full. On a Tuesday afternoon in March 2024, Evelyn Greb sat down at her kitchen table with 3 banker's boxes from the attic. In the third box, wrapped in a piece of flannel cloth, was a cedar chest approximately the size of a shoebox. Inside the chest, beneath a stack of old prayer cards and a rosary, was a copy of a family Bible. And tucked inside the Bible's front cover, folded in thirds, the paper yellowed and brittle at the creases, was a letter. Evelyn read it once. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still for a long time. She called her attorney the following morning. Her attorney called the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office. The call was transferred to the cold case unit, which had been established in 2021 as part of a statewide initiative to review unsolved crimes from the previous century. The detective who took that call was investigator Ann Borowski, who had been with the Luzerne County DA's office for 9 years. She drove to Evelyn Greb's home that same afternoon with an evidence kit and a pair of cotton gloves. The letter was handwritten in a small, cramped hand on plain stationery. It was addressed to no one. It was signed with a first name only. Walter. It was dated October 19, 1966, 3 days after Dorothy Haynes disappeared. In it, Walter Greb described an encounter on Chestnut Street on the afternoon of Sunday, October 16th. He described an argument. He described what happened when that argument ended. He had written it, apparently, in the immediate hours or days following the event, and then, for reasons the letter itself did not explain, had never sent it, never destroyed it, and never spoken of it. He had folded it into a Bible and put it in a cedar chest in his attic. And there it had sat for 58 years. Borowski photographed the letter on site. She had it transported to the State Forensics Lab in Harrisburg, where document analysts confirmed its age, paper composition, and ink chemistry as consistent with the mid-1960s. Handwriting comparison against a sample of Walter Grebb's signature from county records confirmed authorship with high confidence. Patricia Lemke received a phone call from investigator Borowski on a Wednesday morning in April 2024. She was standing in her kitchen when she answered. She sat down on the floor. Walter Grebb had been, by every external measure, a perfectly ordinary man. He had worked for 22 years at a freight hauling company in Scranton. He had coached Little League Baseball in the early 1970s. He had served as a lector at St. Michael's Parish on alternating Sundays for a decade. His neighbors on Caruso Street remembered him as private, a little brusque, the kind of man who kept a tidy lawn and didn't linger at the fence. His son Russell had moved away as soon as he was old enough to do so, and had visited infrequently after that. Nobody had ever asked why. His connection to Dorothy Haynes had never been secret. Exactly. They were members of the same parish, had grown up in the same neighborhood, had been known to each other since childhood. What was not known outside a small circle was the nature of what had existed between them in the years before Dorothy's disappearance. The letter made it plain. In the years between 1963 and 1966, according to what Walter Grebb described in his own hand, he and Dorothy had been involved in an arrangement he characterized as a friendship that had become something more. Dorothy, the letter indicated, had ended that arrangement in the summer of 1966. She had done so firmly. She had told him she did not intend to revisit the decision. He had not accepted it. On the afternoon of October 16th, Grebb had gone to Chestnut Street. He had knocked on Dorothy's door. When she opened it, an argument began. He described it as becoming physical. He described her falling. He described himself leaving. He did not, in the letter, use the word that described what he had done, but the document analysts at the state lab noted that the letter's final lines, 3 sentences written in a noticeably different pressure of hand, as though added after the rest was complete, read, "In their translation of the faded ink, I did not mean for it. I did not know what else to do. God forgive me." Investigator Borowski worked with the state forensics team to establish what the letter could and could not prove. Walter Grebb was dead. There would be no arrest. There would be no trial. What the letter could establish, in conjunction with the partial evidence preserved in the original case file, was a documented account of events from the perpetrator himself, sufficient for the Luzerne County DA's office to formally close the Haynes case as a homicide committed by Walter Grebb on October 16, 1966. That formal closure was issued on May 14, 2024. The question of where Dorothy Haynes' remains are located has not been answered. Investigators, following Grebb's letter, and a careful examination of properties associated with him in 1966, identified a search area in a wooded tract east of Pittston Township. That search was ongoing as of the time of this recording. The community that had known Walter Grebb, that had sat beside him in the same pew for decades, that had received communion from the same priest, that had coached alongside him at Little League games in the summer of 1971, received the news with a quiet that is particular to small places when they learn the truth about someone they thought they knew. Patricia Lemke, when the DA's office called to tell her the case had been formally closed, asked only one question: whether Dorothy would have known the man at her door. She would have, the investigator confirmed. She would have opened it herself. Dorothy Haynes was 34 years old. She planted marigolds in her classroom window boxes every September. She hummed while she worked. She called her sister every Sunday. She had a savings account she had been building toward Ireland, and a framed photograph of a dog named Biscuit on her kitchen windowsill, and 11 years of 5th graders who had called her Miss Hum and meant it as the warmest thing they knew how to say. She deserved 50 years she never got. A memorial service was held at St. Michael's Parish on June 8, 2024, 58 years after Dorothy had last sat in one of those pews on a Sunday morning. Patricia Lemke organized it. A small group of people came, a few remaining members of the parish who were old enough to remember Dorothy's name, some of Patricia's own family. Several former students now in their 60s and 70s who had tracked down the news and made the drive. One woman, 81 years old, brought a marigold. Patricia placed a framed photograph of Dorothy at the front of the church. It showed her standing in her classroom doorway in the spring of 1966, laughing at something outside the frame, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looks, in the photograph, like someone in the middle of a very good day. The case of Dorothy Haynes produced at least one tangible change. In 2025, Luzerne County passed a measure requiring that all physical evidence and investigative notes associated with open missing persons and homicide cases be centrally archived in a digital format and cross-referenced under the subject's name, a direct response to the misfiling of Malchewski's notes in 1967, which had removed Walter Greb's name from the active investigation for nearly 6 decades. 58 years is a long time for a letter to stay hidden, longer still for a family to carry the weight of a question without an answer. Carol Haynes spent 53 years of her life asking what happened to her sister. She died without hearing it. Her daughter heard it for her. There is something worth holding on to in that. Truth does not always arrive on time, but it is remarkably hard to destroy entirely. Walter Greb folded it into a Bible and put it in a cedar chest and closed the lid. And it waited. Here is what we'd like you to think about. Do you believe the formal closure of this case, without a trial or a sentence, constitutes justice for Dorothy? Or only an answer? What does it mean that the person who preserved the only evidence of the crime was the perpetrator himself? And what do you make of a community that unknowingly honored a killer every Sunday for decades, and what that asks of all of us about the people we think we know? Justice found Dorothy Haynes after 58 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.